start recording. Great. So this is a safe space. We just ask everyone to be respectful. Any nasty comments or anything, we will be removing you from the event. But welcome anyone who wants to share their experience later on in the event. That would be great, but there's also no pressure to. But anything that you want to share, it's, as I said, a safe space. So this is the fourth event in our Who is Welcome series, and today we're going to be discussing queerness in migration, including the experiences of queer migrants and queer people of colour. We've got some really great speakers today. So we have Benali Hamdache, who's Green Party Migrant and Refugee Support Spokesperson and Highbury Councillor for Islington Council. We're also going to be joined by Aliosis Sali, who is founder and CEO of Say It Loud Club. And we also have Anna, who is digital marketing assistant here at the Migrants Rights Network. I'm Julia, I'm going to be chairing today. I'm Policy and Strategic Communication Manager here at MRN, and I'm also a member of the queer activist group Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants. This is a group that was inspired by Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners in the 1980s. We're a queer activist group that stands in solidarity with other communities facing state violence and media attacks. In the current political climate, migrants bear the brunt of far-right violence, face demonisation in the media, and are criminalised by the state. LGS migrants use the strength and the queer community and an understanding of our history of struggle to fight back in support of those at the sharpest end of government oppression today. So at the Migrants Rights Network, we look at migration and displacement through an intersectional lens. We analyse and raise awareness of how identity impacts policy decisions towards specific groups. Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year and Europe's subsequent treatment of Ukrainian refugees in comparison to Afghan, Syrian or Sudanese people raised questions about who is welcome in Europe and the UK. As part of our ongoing Who is Welcome event series, we want to examine specifically how border regimes impact queer people seeking safety for a better life. It wasn't that long ago that LGBT plus people were considered to be the illegals, and queer pubs and bars were being targeted in police raids and subject to state violence. Now it's the homes and workplaces of migrants that are targeted. Queerness is weaponized by the state and media, and hard-won rights for LGBT plus people are presented as part of, quote, Britishness or European values. And migrants, particularly Muslim migrants, are constructed as a threat to these values. As queer people, it's really important we see through this attempt to pit oppressed and exploited groups against each other. So bearing all that in mind, I'd like to welcome our first speaker. I'm going to hand over to Benali. I'll just unmute you. Oh, there we go.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to start with a tiny apology because I'm booked into another talk immediately after, so I'm speaking with the French Green Party, so I'm going to be leaving a little bit early, but I'll make sure that we've got the opportunity to answer questions and engage. And thank you for making the time. I wanted to talk a little bit about just a very personal story to me, because for me this is very personal. I grew up in a very socially conservative house, and I discovered that I was gay when I was a teenager, and that was a heart-wrenching and a really difficult journey to go through, that was made worse. My parents found out I was gay via my online diary. My dad didn't respond particularly well, and I experienced kind of violence and abuse at home, and getting to that journey of finding out who I was and getting out of that home wasn't easy. But then I think about countless other people in that place and in that situation who don't have the freedoms that I had as a British citizen, whose only opportunity to find freedom in a safe harbour was having to escape the country that they were born in, and then having to find not a warm welcome when they come to this country, but interrogation, a hostile government, awful conditions. I know how bad my situation was. I can only begin to imagine how worse these people's situation is. And so I think we have to humanize these stories. I think people understand those stories increasingly. And we have to get people to put themselves in that context. But I'd also say it's also why I'm furious that voices on the right use my identity or my story to argue against migration. We've got a rising tide of populist right voices who will say that migrants threaten the kind of welcoming or accepting culture of Western Europe. Well, first of all, we should remember that voices like Marine Le Pen have been at the forefront of fighting against LGBT rights, and their appropriation of these issues are a matter of political convenience, not a matter of truly felt and understood issues. And again, this idea that homophobia and transphobia are something that is imported from without. Well, we only have to look at the state of the UK today to understand that one of the biggest propagators of bigotry is the UK government today. We only had Miriam Cates making up things about things that were in sex education in schools, and kind of a pink panic about what children might be learning in schools. I think our biggest opponent to a more unfair, inclusive society are conservative voices in this context. And I see allyship and I see opportunity with oppressed groups, and I should just absolutely endorse that message that we shouldn't be pitting each other against each other. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of really stake out at the beginning that these are real people's lives that are being crushed underfoot with naked politics. We have an absolutely atrocious bill threatening to come to Parliament next week, the illegal migration bill. The illegal in it should be because it is illegal. It is breaking various rules and international commitments, and we need to fight it every step of the way. And I think we do that by telling people stories, by boosting the voices of underrepresented groups, and we do it by standing together in allyship and not letting our opponents divide us.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing your experience with everyone. You talked a lot about how the experience of queer people is kind of being used, and I was wondering if you think that has intensified over the last few years, or if it's just part of an ongoing trend towards LGBT people.
Unhelpfully unmuting myself then. Well, I think, unfortunately, in some parts of Europe, I do think particularly in Marine Le Pen, right-wing voices in Europe have found it a convenient voice to fight. Similarly in Netherlands, you had far-right voices who would also, pitch migrants against LGBT people for political gain. And I think people see, these networks are networked in. They do take what's successful elsewhere and bring it elsewhere. But I also think we live in an era of really heightened culture war. You have a government that is failing on the fundamentals on every single aspect, from public services to trust and sleaze and competence. And so the only battles that they think that they can win are on this front. And so when it comes to winning votes, it's about attacking oppressed groups. And the only issue, I saw some polling today, the only issue that the Conservatives might have a lead on it is on immigration and stopping the boats for people who prioritise that. And that's why they're going particularly hard on this. And it's about saving seats, and it's about getting more Tory MPs elected at the next election. And it should be unacceptable. It should be something that our media should be holding a lens to. But unfortunately, we've lost our sense of proportion. I think one of the really stunning things I think this week was Suella Braverman holding up the idea that 100 million refugees would want to come to this country. And then in the same sentence saying, well, we're having to deal with 40,000 people every year. 40,000 is a tiny proportion of that many million. shouldn't that bring some perspective to the idea of how many refugees our country is helping versus countless others? Shouldn't that give us a sense that we are not doing our fair share compared to anywhere else when we are one of the richest countries in the world? And shouldn't media companies take a second just to think about when they are talking about a number in the 5 figures? Should they be repeating it so breathlessly and so out of proportion? It is a tiny increase in the UK population, and it doesn't meet, it's not even the biggest increase ever. So we can and we should be doing our bit to support refugees. But the fact is that, the media have lost all sense of proportion and politicians are exploiting it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's perhaps no coincidence at a time where we are facing multiple national crises that this is the issue that the government are absolutely focused on and really contributing to ramping up the rhetoric, but also against queer people and trans people as well, because I think it's not a stretch to say that those are two of the most vulnerable, quote, vulnerable groups that there are, and they're not voiceless, but they don't necessarily have the platforms to use that voice, and it makes them a very easy target. And I think we've seen history shown us that that's often the way out when a government is facing multiple crises.
I mean, you look at why the far right are organising right now. Where are the far right protesting? They're protesting outside Drag Race story time. They're protesting outside refugee hotels. They're scaremongering about sex education and what's being taught in schools. And they're out in Kent causing havoc. I mean, that shows you where, they think the pressure points are, where the opportunity to exploit and mobilise and organise is. And that shows you first and foremost where we should be fighting. I do think, the future of a fair and liberal and democratic Britain, these are two really important instances where, what we believe or what we hope this country is are being tested really live, and standing up for the rights of the minorities and not letting, most importantly, right, these rights to be stripped back. That's where we are, right? We're fighting to keep not gain or expand, but actually protect the rights for sex education in schools. And a combat, it wasn't long ago that things were better for refugees and migrants in terms of hosting and where they might be, the context that they might be put in, not to portray the past as some halcyon days, but God, they weren't as bad as the Manson Detention Centre or some of these really grim hotels that people are being placed in. And you've got Conservative MPs and the far right pretending that people are being stuck up in kind of 5-star Hilton hotels. The distortion and the lies are there for political and cultural gain, and they have to be exposed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that they know could get people quite angry and emotional, because we're facing, even before the cost of living crisis, a real drop in living standards, and it's quite easy to then get people angry about asylum seekers being in the idea of these really glamorous hotels. It really riles people up, and it's because it's very easy.
Absolutely. And there's again, thinking about a lot of queer migrants right now, actually these hotels are really difficult situations and circumstances. I've got examples of people having to turn to sex work in these places just for some connection of LGBT life. You've got also the fact that sometimes these contexts aren't always very welcoming, or they aren't always particularly convenient. I mean, if you're a refugee trying to claim residence here on the basis of your gender and sexuality, you're expected to prove that you are living the life of that as someone who will be that identity. Well, if you're stuck in a rural hotel in the middle of nowhere in god-awful conditions, how can you prove that? How can you be expected to make that case? And so, really, the the context that people find themselves in because of this government, I mean, it's hard not to come to the conclusion that they're deliberately stacked against people to make these cases in this instances harder, not easier.
Yeah, definitely. I think something that really we do a lot of reflecting on at MRN, and you mentioned earlier about the experiences of queer people being appropriated by the state, is that the government kind, you know, what we saw it with Qatar, in Qatar experience, their approach to the LGBT community was kind of weaponized for a foreign policy point, and it kind of served this purpose to make us look like we were this liberal, inclusive utopia. And yet at the same time, we know that LGBT asylum seekers face a culture of disbelief and gaslighting. And it's as you say, there's this expectation to kind of prove your sexuality or prove what your gender identity is. And how on earth can you ask that of someone? And how can we be this liberal utopia if we're demanding that of people? And also it's a very binary view of sexuality, that you have to fit into one of these boxes and you live by certain stereotypes of what it is to be LGBT. I mean, there's someone in our MRN community who is queer, is bi, and they are trying to claim asylum. And how on earth are you supposed to prove that you're bi? And I think the way that we look at sexuality and the way that we treat people and utilize the queer experience shows that we've got a long way to go.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think the fact is as well is that as soon as you come to this country and try to claim asylum based on your sexuality and gender, it's pretty strong to say, I mean, it's pretty easy to make a case that going back to your country is going to be dangerous. Like if you've gone to another, you know, I knew a student at my university who had gone to Pride while he was on a student visa from Saudi. He had a letter from the embassy saying that we've been told that you've been doing this and you will face consequences if you come back to if you continue this. So the idea that we're then sending people back to countries where it's illegal to be homosexual after you've tried to make a claim on your gender and sexuality, just that alone should be indicative of the danger that we're putting people in and the circumstance that we're putting people in. And so, yeah, and you know, there's been some very good FOIs over the year to show that the huge amounts of people that we're sending back to countries where it is illegal to be gay, who have made a claim based on their gender or sexuality. And yeah, I mean, I just think, you know, I think also there's a big call here for the LGBT community to come out in solidarity and to reject this kind of easy to be convinced by perhaps and argument. And I see too many members of the LGBT community embracing this argument and saying, actually, well, migrants endanger us and you know, when I think of what should be at the forefront of Pride and what should be the things that we're still campaigning for, it is trans rights and it's migrants' rights. And you know, by no means should we feel that, you know, oh, we've won all those issues, that they're done, we've won our rights. Some people have won most of their rights, but not all of us at all. And there has to be some solidarity. And I think as well, like, you know, I think we have to look deep in ourselves that sometimes, you know, migrants can face fetishization, they can face exploitation, they can face racism in our community. And then when it comes to us them needing us to stand in solidarity, we're found wanting or we're found missing. And I think that's a really sad story. I mean, I will say, you know, there's countless organizations like Lesbians and Gays stand with the migrants to counter that and stand with that. But, you know, our rights are just as intertwined. And I think, you know, if migrants keep losing their rights, we have to look where's next. And the far right are exploiting that. And absolutely, like, if it's the illegal migrants bill next week, is it rolling back sex education rules in PSHE the week after? I think we have to stand for a liberal society, and putting one group in a box and letting go of their rights is dangerous to all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, that's very much part of our work at LGSM is, I mean, we particularly when we go and fundraise, sometimes we'll go and fundraise in Soho, you know, the real heart of the London queer scene. And I remember we were fundraising at Christmas and someone said, oh, well, we don't want any more migrants. And actually, when you remind them how, as I said in the beginning, it wasn't that long ago that queer spaces were being raided. And actually, we are facing a lot of queer spaces closing. That in itself is a whole movement at the moment that, as you say, those struggles are absolutely intertwined. And that's why queer solidarity is so important. Well, thank you. I'm going to, before I pass over to Anna, I just want to make sure, is anyone from Say It Loud Club here? And if you are, can you hold your hand up? We're having a little bit of trouble getting hold of them. No? Okay. Hopefully they will join soon. I'm going to pass on to our next speaker then. So I'm going to pass over to Anna, who is our digital marketing assistant at MRN. So over to you.
Hi everyone, thanks Julia, thanks Benali. Yeah, so I guess I kind of just want to talk about a couple of different things, like from a personal standpoint, but also from like a more general standpoint. So like the first thing I kind of want to talk about is how like sort of this idea of queerness as extending like sort of beyond sexuality and beyond gender and actually sort of encompassing other areas of our lives, and how that can kind of help us understand maybe like our migration status or like our status as a member of like a diasporic community. So I kind of wanted to start with like what the book like Cruising Utopia kind of says on the matter, which is basically the idea that queerness is like, as it being like beyond gender and sexuality, is kind of like a sort of very like resistive kind of orientation, and it's this sort of intense like dissatisfaction with how the world is, and it's this sort of idea that we mustn't settle for how things are, and that we must always strive for liberation and for better things, pretty much. And it's basically like, in a sense, about like reclaiming like this non-conformity or this label of deviance, and kind of like sort of rejecting any of these like structures that, you know, cause a lot of harm, like structures of racial capitalism, imperialism, and colonial logic, and any kind of structures really. So it's really an orientation that kind of seeks to like defy the mainstream and kind of assert itself and be like proud in that. So I guess sort of one of the things I wanted to touch on is the idea of like queering migration. So the way migration is kind of conceptualized, as in like in official, like formal ways, is the movement of people across internationally recognized borders. So that's like the standard definition. But if we sort of queer migration and maybe look at it in more expansive way, we can see that actually, you know, like people who are internally displaced also like deserve like recognition, and they deserve their struggles to be like talked about, because that can be as like damaging and traumatizing as moving across an internationally recognized border. And I know for myself, like with my community, a lot of my community, or like a lot of us, like our grandparents or our parents, might have been like internally displaced. So I feel like it's really important to understand that that too can like be traumatizing. And it's this idea that, I guess, when we have like the nation state, in my personal opinion, I've been thinking about this a lot, and it's kind of the idea that anything that kind of defies that or goes beyond that, or goes beyond like the sort of acceptable boundaries of behavior or the acceptable ways of being. So like, if you're not white, if you're not straight, if you're a migrant, if you don't have citizenship, if you're working class, like any of these different things, they all like make you sort of queer in a way, because you kind of defy like the purpose of like the British state, which is like white people, like straight people, and it excludes all these different groups. So as Benali was saying, like it's important to find solidarity between these different groups, because all these groups are queered and made to be deviant and seen as a threat. And it's what like Julia was saying, is in like queer spaces have historically been raided. Now, sort of like spaces where there's loads of like undocumented migrants, now they get raided. So it's like sort of being attentive to these like continuations of like patterns of violence that have been happening to like lots of different communities, and actually realizing that it says more about the people that do it to us as opposed to about us, pretty much. And again, like in terms of being like a member of a diasporic community that lives in the UK, you never quite feel, so like I'm from Cyprus, so I will never quite feel Cypriot enough, and I also never quite feel British enough. And I think that in a sense is quite like non-conforming, because it's like you're not really part of one, but you're not really part of the other. But in a sense, you can also be part of both. So it's kind of like, I guess the label of queer to me means sort of looking at like our experiences beyond gender and sexuality, and sort of seeing actually like we are also sort of constructed to be deviant or constructed to be a threat in multiple ways that like go beyond gender and that go beyond sexuality, really. And for my own personal context, I found that sort of because I come from a place that was like colonized, and there are certain narratives that come about because of colonization that influence your personal identity and how you see yourself. And actually, in my context, asserting that I am Cypriot without any kind of prefix is a very like queer and like resistive thing, because the dominant discourses say that you have to belong to like one identity camp or another identity camp. You have to be either Greek or Turkish, and those are colonially imposed labels. So actually, sort of, I use queerness to think about my like my ethnicity and my heritage as well, and to be like, no, me saying that I'm Cypriot is actually very defiant, and in some ways, I would argue that it's queer. So that's kind of like what I wanted to say about sort of like from a more personal standpoint, encouraging like us to think about how can queerness be mapped onto like migration and heritage and all these different kind of things. But yeah, I have some more things to say, but I don't know if we want to like maybe break for like questions or something.
No, I think you made some really interesting points, and certainly like I have got a few questions, but if you want to maybe carry on, and then we can kind of do like our questions for you and Benali after.
Yeah, that sounds good. So I kind of also wanted to speak about like homonationalism a little bit. And I don't know how many of you are aware of what homonationalism is, but it's basically, it's sort of the way that, I mean, the way I conceptualize it is like in two parts. So it's the way that sort of LGBT issues are kind of like weaponized in the service of like foreign intervention, kind of similarly to how, you know, women's rights are weaponized in that way as well. So like when the West goes and invades like different countries in the Middle East, they use this rhetoric of, oh, we're saving the women because, you know, they belong to these like awful backwards cultures. So it's kind of that, but to do with queer people as opposed to do with women. So it's in a sense using LGBT rights and weaponizing them and appropriating our struggle in order to justify and legitimize really harmful like foreign policy ideas, and just basically to justify imperial interventions. And I guess the other part of homonationalism is sort of the idea that it kind of looks at the way that some like queer people are sort of folded into the nation. So what I was saying before about how like a lot of us are like constructed as a threat because of our queerness, dependent on the person and dependent on how much they uphold like white supremacy or like they uphold like harmful ideas, they might be co-opted and like brought into the nation. So usually that would be queers who are white, queer people who have like a lot of like social and financial capital, queer people who are straight. So this always like excludes like Black, brown, like racialized, working class queer people who are basically who will never really be folded into the nation in a permanent sense. They will only ever be folded into the nation temporarily in order to justify like imperialism. So in order to be like, we deem you worthy of protection in this exact moment, but once we go and invade your country, then, you know, you're not worthy of protection anymore. So we're really using you to get our way. So yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to say about like homonationalism. And that can also be like complicated if we sort of take it further and we combine necropolitics with homonationalism. So necropolitics is basically a concept that was created by Achille Mbembe. And he basically argues that the way that states work under our current system, under our current capitalist system, is that the state deliberately creates like conditions of suffering and like decimation for certain people. And then it kind of like obscures that by sort of creating wealth and abundance for other people. And so like an example of this is the way that the power and the wealth of like modern Europe like depends on and is maintained by like murdering and debilitating Black, brown and racialized people through centuries of all these different kinds of like colonial atrocities. And yeah, and we sort of see like today, like obviously like a lot of people who are seeking asylum in the UK, a lot of people who are coming to Europe, they are coming because they are fleeing conditions that were precipitated by colonialism. So it's really important to bear that in mind, because obviously like those legacies persist to this day. And sort of going off of necropolitics and looking at queer necropolitics, which is a concept proposed by Jasbir Puar, that basically looks at how necropolitics applies to queer people, how some queer people, they are deliberately subjected to like horrible things by the state, and that is then disguised by giving some queer people wealth and abundance and just giving them a really good life. And I think a really pertinent example of like queer necropolitics is the way that, like, for instance, the British Army and the Metropolitan Police, they present themselves as very queer friendly, and they attend London Pride, and they'll have like LGBT flags in their bios during like Pride Month and all these kind of things. But it's like, well, the British Army is going abroad and like killing loads of people, including queer people who live in other parts of the world. So that's very much like the glaring issue with pinkwashing, pretty much. And another sort of way that we see like sort of violence and like sort of violence being enacted against queer people is sort of another concept. And what I can do is I can write all these concepts in the chat after I finish speaking, so people can refer back to them. But this is a concept by Seema Shagsari called the politics of rightful killing. And basically it goes into what I was talking about before, how queer migrants or queer asylum seekers even are temporarily deemed worthy of protection. And that's used to then justify like imperialism abroad and all these kind of things. But then once these queer asylum seekers actually come to the West, and once they come to the UK or they go to America, because their purpose is fulfilled, their function is fulfilled, in order to, the function being to justify interventions, they're no longer seen as worthy of protection, and they like die of neglect. So I mean, I'm not going to share like specificities, but if you were to type in like queer asylum seeker dies into Google, you would see like plenty of examples of how basically queer asylum seekers, like a lot of them will suffer in like horrific ways because they're not seen as worthy anymore. And kind of the sort of last facet of like homonationalism that I wanted to look at is sort of the ways that it can help us explain like gentrification, especially to do with like sort of the queer scene, so to speak. So obviously, like, as we know, like, or as some of you may know, some of you may not know, but yeah, the way European cities are constructed today is like an extension of empire. So like the gentrification and the policing and the surveillance and the pushing people out of communities that we see today, that's an extension of urban planning techniques that were basically utilized in cities that were under colonial rule. Basically, homonecronationalism is like looking at the ways that it's the focus on the suffering, but pairing that with homonationalism. So that basically looks at how gentrification applies to like queer people and queer spaces. So it's about how sort of it's about how like when you have like one element of it being the folding of some deserving queer people into the nation, that then obscures the way that some queer people are framed as economically unproductive, they're framed as a threat, and they cannot be folded into the nation. So then what happens to them is then their spaces get raided, shut down, and this tends to happen to like working class, diasporic, or Black and brown queer people. So their spaces are deemed unproductive, they're shut down. They will be subjected to like ASBOs, a lot of surveillance, a lot of policing, and that will push them out of their areas. And what that does is then that makes space for a very white, capitalist, gay scene to enter and take its place. So like an example is the sort of through gentrification, areas such as like Hackney, Soho, Brixton, which have like vivid histories of like Black LGBTQ spaces and organizing, they then become sites of like rainbow capitalism and like very commercialized white gay nightlife. And yeah, the original residents are basically like pushed out and subjected to like marginalization and expulsion. And that also makes me think about, it's no wonder that a lot of us a lot of, I guess, migrants or migrantized people living in the UK who are also queer, like a lot of us might struggle to find like histories that we can sort of use to like affirm our identities. Like we might struggle to, like I might struggle to find histories of like Cypriot queer organizing in the UK, or any kind of histories of migrant queer organizing in the UK. And it makes me think it's no wonder, because like all these like organizing spaces, all these communities are effectively like shut down and pushed out. So it's no wonder then that history becomes really inaccessible and hard to find. So pretty much I just wanted to sort of look at the ways that the state kind of disguises its violence against queer people, against migrants, and the way that some people are temporarily included in order to justify really horrible things abroad, and other people will, never be included. So that's pretty much it. And I hope that made sense. And I can write some notes in the chat. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Anna. That was really interesting. And you certainly raised a lot of points that I've got questions, and I think there are some questions in the chat as well. But I think particularly the point you made about pink washing, that's something that I feel really strongly about, like how Pride has kind of shifted to this very like corporate event that, is really quite inaccessible now to a lot of groups who want to march in it. And as you said, we see a lot of big corporations coming out with their rainbow banners. I was marching at a Pride last summer, and we were stood next to this poster that said ban conversion therapy for all, and then it had wicks at the bottom. So we thought like, okay, weird, but fine. But this is actually something that I know there's a lot of movements happening, particularly in London, about reclaiming pride for the community, and how our experience is used to kind of sell products. But also something I think as well is the point you made about the police. LGSM, it was just before I joined, but they did an action at Pride last year where they did a die-in front of the police parade. And there is at Brighton Pride as well that I went to last summer, there was a lot of resistance about the presence of police at Pride. And of course, we're not saying that there aren't queer police officers, and it's not to deny their experience, but as an institution, I think it's very hard to argue that the police is not inherently homophobic or has been very complicit in the treatment of the queer community. And I think it's important that we don't forget that and we don't overlook it, and that is why the presence of police at Pride causes so much hurt for queer people. And Benali, you raised a point in the chat as well about Stephen Poor, and also the fact that homophobia is still very rampant in the police force, unfortunately. Also as well, this, I think, something that stood out to me when you were talking about homo nationalism, and it's a theme that we've talked about a lot in this discussion, is how queer history is utilised, and HIV/AIDS is obviously still a huge part of our past and present. On the progressive pride flag, which is, those who don't know, the pride flag has a triangle in the corner, there's a black strip, and that is for the people who have died of AIDS in the community. So it's very much embedded in our history. And I think it was back in 2014 when Nigel Farage said that immigrants who have HIV or AIDS should be banned from coming into the UK. And that's obviously a really abhorrent thing to say, but it shows how that kind of hysteria about HIV and AIDS is still very much used against migrants and queer migrants, and that we haven't really moved on from a lot of the stereotypes that exist. And there's an organisation called ACT UP who did a die-in, I think it was just before Christmas, in Trafalgar Square, because they're still very actively campaigning about the treatment that is there for HIV or AIDS patients, but also how the state has been complicit in what they view as the murder of people with HIV/AIDS by the state. So yeah, there were just some of my thoughts that came up while you were speaking, but I think there are so many interesting points that you raised. I have a couple of questions, but I know there's one in the chat. If anyone else does have some as well, please raise your hand or put them in the chat. If you don't want to read them out, I can read them out to our guests. I would also like to say we are chasing Say It Loud Club. We don't know if they run into some tech issues or what's happened, but we are still trying to get hold of them. But I do apologise for that. So I've got, I guess, quite a couple of profound questions for the panel. But I'm starting off with a not so easy one. I mean, we've talked a lot about how queer people and migrants are kind of centre stage in this culture war that is happening at the moment. How can we as queer people and also our allies take steps to try and combat this? Like, what things can we do in our everyday lives or in our communities to try and combat this?
I mean, I would say it's sort of understanding that all different struggles are actually very strongly interconnected. So they must always be addressed. Sort of single issue politics is a detriment to everyone. And so the struggle for migrant justice, the struggle for queer justice, they have to be seen in tandem with each other. Because as Benali was saying earlier, there's sort of the argument that, migrants are bringing homophobia into the UK, which is a very harmful thing to say and also not true. And also there's no nuance to that. There's no consideration of the fact that a large proportion of countries that still retain some kind of anti-sodomy laws were former British colonies. There's no understanding of the ways that actually colonialism creates literal crisis zones where people are struggling to survive. So how can people think about identity and rights where they're literally struggling to survive and they could die at any moment? So it's just really understanding these nuances and just not looking at queerness through a white lens, and just really understanding that colonialism, decolonization has to be a part of the conversation, because otherwise you're not really going to get anywhere, and you're just going to shame migrants. You're just going to pit migrants against queer people, and then also that excludes queer people who are also migrants. So it's, single issue politics is not the way to go.
I was going to kind of say, I think for me, the power of storytelling is something that we can all take into our everyday lives. I'm always really inspired by, actually, you look at the change in attitudes towards gay people has been the biggest social shift in attitudes in history that's ever been recorded. Now, how did that happen? Well, it happened because people came out and told their story, and suddenly, instead of gay people being this abstract person who was trying to convert your child in a school, that was your friend, it was your neighbor, it was a colleague. And so gay people became real, and it became harder to discriminate against. And what we need to do is we need to do the same for migrants. We need to help boost their stories, we need to tell their stories, we need to share their stories. We need to, when we're going to Pride and we're lobbying for what Pride should be about, it should be about championing migrants' rights and the intersection of LGBT rights and migrants' rights. We should be using our platforms that we have access to boost those voices, volunteer and support organisations that are doing the good work to do that effectively. There's some brilliant work out there, some brilliant organisations that I'd really recommend supporting, including the Migrants Rights Network. I'd also say, I think there's also something about thinking about where we spend our money and what we do. I'm always very conscious of, well, I've not been to heaven in a very long time. I say not the gay club in London, not the place up in the sky. But, Jeremy Joseph has said some terrible things about migrants, and that is a club that will turn away women for not looking gay enough, has been accused of turning away black men from the doors. Why would anyone spend their money there? If I think there's maybe an ethical attitude to where we go and support our scene. Are we supporting queer nights? Are we supporting inclusive nights? Are we supporting a culture that makes our scene as inclusive as possible so people can go and find their place? Because again, I go back to that point, right, that people are expected to prove their sexuality or prove their gender to be allowed to stay in this country. Well, if our community is not welcoming, how are they going to be able to do that? Did I have another point? I think that let's stop there, because I think that the final one has escaped me, but I'll come back to it. Oh wait, no, I remember. Sorry, there we go. I hate London Pride, and I will echo lots of that, what was said earlier. I do remember one year that I ended up being placed next to Serco. Serco, of course, operate a lot of detention centres. So no pride in Serco for me. But however, we had a sign, and we'd made signs about migrant inclusion and fighting for LGBT asylum seekers, and there was some people who were there to march with the group for LGBT asylum seekers, and I remember someone stopping me and saying how much that sign mattered to them. And for me, however much I hated London Pride for being what it is, and being there with that sign and having made that person's day better was really important to me. So I just think, how do we use our spaces to show welcoming and support for people who are at the sharp end of both being a migrant or asylum seeker and being LGBT plus in a society that we know where both of those things are getting harder, not easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I remember that point about representation at Pride is so important. I was at Pride and a friend of mine was in a wheelchair and we were pushing her, and someone actually ran out from the crowd just to give her a hug, because it was so important for them to see someone marching in Pride who was quite visibly disabled. So, and that really made my friend really emotional. So yeah, Pride, as annoying as it is now, I think, yeah, that it is ultimately about solidarity. Just looking in the chat, and there's a couple of questions here, and I'm aware that you've got to leave soon, Benali, so I'll try and get through them quickly. There's one here about I really appreciated Benali and Anna's comments on how bordering tactics occur both as violent tech at physical nation-state borders as well as internally in body and minds. Would any of the speakers mind speaking further on where there is bordering happening? What are the UK's bordering strategies, and how can we interrupt these strategies? I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, I was going to say like a very obvious bordering strategy is like, I mean, historically, but it also has lasting legacies to this day, is divide and rule in the way that different communities are pitted against each other. And if anything, you can kind of see that being replicated in how like different groups, like migrants and queer people, are being like pit against each other and being used as pawns in a really like nefarious game. So yeah, like divide and rule like creates borders. It makes you blame your like compatriot instead of the person in power. So 100% that. And I guess bordering kind of like, I would say that it kind of like occurs like everywhere, even in places that you wouldn't think it would occur. Because when people think of borders, they think of like a checkpoint, or they think of a like a literal border crossing, or they think of an immigration detention center. But actually, like bordering sort of functions in multiple ways in our everyday lives. And as Hannah was saying, like, for instance, like bordering keeps people from access to resources like housing, employment, safety, and all that kind of stuff. So bordering is a lot more expansive than merely just, you know, an actual like physical wall or like a checkpoint. It's actually, sometimes you can't really touch it, but it's like there. It's like intangible. So it's like, it's to do with mentalities. It's to do with this idea that people are pitted against each other, and people like a queer person will blame a migrant instead of blaming the state that that basically suppresses both of them. So yeah, that's kind of what I'd have to add.
I mean, in tech, I mean, I mentioned the tech. Tech is how we are creating borders without checkpoints, right? Like the rollout of facial recognition software is something that we should all be deeply concerned about. The Metropolitan Police have been trialing facial recognition software in a number of sites. In its trial, it has been found to be incredibly inaccurate at recognizing black and brown faces, resulting in a number of false stop and searches. So if we think about how bad stop and searches are now, you imagine how much worse they are when a computer can't recognize someone's face properly. It's going to make it happen. You know, it's outrageous that they're continuing with this trial even after the software has been shown to be an expensive waste of time that forces more racist interactions. But, you know, I think, yeah, unfortunately, tech is another way that will create more borders and less access for people. And it is all embedded in the hostile environment policies of the 2014 immigration bill. That means that migrants and children of migrants as well actually face it much harder to get access to services, whether that's setting up a bank account and being able to prove where they live, or being able to rent a home. You know, is already proven that this policy forces people who are have an identifiably foreign name to view more houses, get refused more tenancies, don't get to see as many houses because landlords can't be bothered to do the nationality checks. You know, we have a government that via the hostile environment policy is forcing more and more parts of society to be border guards for them. And you know, I mean, the biggest thing that we should be fighting for is an amnesty of all citizens. There are so many people right now who are undocumented in this country, who work, who are being exploited, who don't have access to services, and an amnesty for those citizens is long overdue. And you will forgive me for being my one-party political point of the day, but I'm very proud to be part of a political party that supports an amnesty for undocumented migrants, and part of a movement that has won amnesty. You know, amnesties. I mean, the Irish Green Party aren't my favourite, but they have gotten an amnesty for undocumented migrants in Ireland very recently, and it's something that we should be happening in the UK too, because there are people who have been here for years, who have families who have been working hard, but don't have the papers and don't have a fair way to get those papers, and there should be an amnesty.
Yeah, thank you both. Just following on from that question from Hannah, what do converging interests such as access to adequate housing, employment, safety of migrants and queer non-migrants tell us about how bordering functions?
Well, yeah, I think there's an important opportunity for us to fight in common cause. I was really interested by the census data that came out recently about where LGBT people live, and there's lots of gay LGBT people who are doing quite well, who are living in places like Clapham or places that are increasingly expensive. But the data also showed that there's a lot of people who are being pushed to the margins of London because it's all they can afford. I mean, one of the interesting bits of data was that Newham has the biggest trans population in London, and we know that's a community that has less access to work and lower earnings. And so, I do think rent controls and the conversation around them are something that could be really unifying, and not just rent controls for residential homes, but also for commercial properties, because we know how much that actually rising rents are devastating minority-owned business and minority-owned trade. So yeah, I think there's something about how we're watching. Forgive me for being a little bit London-centric, but I think it is being mirrored in Birmingham, Manchester as well, in bigger cities. That the rampant, out of control market when it comes to housing is smashing communities under its heel, and actually uniting together to say that we want to keep the London that we have, rather than a London that looks like Kensington in every corner, which is ultimately as well a London that will never work, a London that won't succeed or thrive. So yeah, that's my immediate thought.
Yeah, thank you. Anna, is there anything else you want to add? I've got a few more questions coming in.
I think, yeah, pretty much what Benali said, and just the idea that, I mean, like that makes me think about sort of compounded oppression. So like queer migrants are like oppressed in like on account of their queerness, on account of their migration status, and obviously queer non-migrants are oppressed in one of those ways, and maybe not in others. But it's really like understanding that like borders affect, I guess, everyone, and sort of the more like marginalized identities you hold, the more it will affect you.
Yeah, absolutely. Benali, there's a question for you. So for many queer people seeking asylum, they live in secret, fearing consequences in their country of origin. Once they get to the UK, they are expected to amplify their identity or sexuality in order to be given protection. And for the fact that being queer is widely reviewed by decision makers of asylum cases as simply falling into gay or lesbian, stereotyping bisexuals or pansexual people. Do you think with the government's plan to slash the backlog by the end of this year, it will lead to a lot of unfair failed claims for queer people?
100%, and we need to raise the red alarm. I mean, it's a funny thing, isn't it, to be looking back to Theresa May and thinking things were a bit better, but we had a government that were making noises, at least noises, about better rights for LGBT refugees, that was acknowledging that the process was flawed. We had some reports that came out with steps that were to be improved. We've had Priti Patel and Suella Braverman come in and rip all of that up. The Nationality and Borders Bill deliberately includes clauses that seek to disadvantage LGBT refugees. So, for instance, the expectation that any evidence that you might need to present for your claim is presented early on, otherwise it'll be counted against you if you don't introduce it straight away. That deliberately discriminates against LGBT refugees. There's also the fact that this effort to get through the backlog, there's increasing evidence that the people that they're bringing on board to bring on that backlog are not trained specialists, do not have the expertise to manage and understand LGBT refugees, and are very much more likely to be making decisions based on crude stereotyping. People do deserve more prompt decision making, and that the fact that people have been waiting for so long is an absolute disgrace. But the government is rushing to kick people out, not to give people a fair hearing or give them sanctuary. And so the priorities are embedded right away. I mean, I would say fundamentally, the Home Office is no longer fit for purpose, and we need to scrap the Home Office and start again. And we need to split out the migration from policing and that kind of totalitarian state that we seem to be witnessing from. And it should be about, I mean, I'd love to see a Ministry of Sanctuary that is focused on giving people safe harbour and giving people new lives. And that change of priorities at the top is long overdue, because unfortunately it's not just ministers, but it's civil servants, it goes down, and that culture of disbelief unfortunately is all too present at too many layers. And on that note, I'm going to have to apologise and rush off, because I'm giving another talk to the French Green Party about the border channels and what we can do together to resist not just lovely Suella Braverman, but Macron as well. And the dreadful situation that many migrants find themselves in the Calais. And I just really want to thank everyone for making the time today and the really thoughtful questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that your next speaking engagement goes well. Thank you very much.
Me too. Thank you so much, everyone.
Great. Yeah, I mean, there was a lot there that Benali said that I think, I mean, particularly about the Home Office and taking the Home Office apart and starting again, I think is something that we at MRN it's a space that we very much moved into. We very much moved into an abolitionist transformational space, because I think we have come to the unanimous agreement that you can't reform something that is not even broken, is rotten by design. And I think we absolutely want to see something that is compassionate, and the Home Office was not founded, our immigration system was not founded on those compassionate principles. I'm sure many of you are aware of a report that came out last year about the racist origins of our immigration policy. So I absolutely, from my point of view as the policy person at MRN, absolutely echo what he was saying. And I think he raised some really important points about, in response to Ernest's question, I think bisexuality is and pansexuality, when you don't perhaps fall into one of those binaries, I think there is an idea within immigration or border force that if you're bi, you can pass as straight, and I think that falls into a lot of other stereotypes around what it is to be bi. And I say that as someone that falls under the bi umbrella, is that you can sort of pretend to be something or fall into one of those binaries. Anna, you made a point in the chat, but I don't know if you want to say it.
Yeah, I was just saying that pretty much the asylum process in the UK, this need to prove yourself, this need to be very open with your sexuality and to effectively come out. These are all things that are a very Western understanding of sexuality, because in other contexts beyond Europe, coming out isn't necessarily always desirable. People might not want to come out, people might feel like they can't come out. And also there are ways of living your life in a fulfilling way that don't require you to come out. So I really want to sort of push back on the narrative that you have to come out in order to be valid as a queer person, because you absolutely don't. And also the asylum process is just very invasive, because why are you putting the burden on something to prove something that is a very intimate part of their lives? And also some sexualities can't be sort of mapped, I guess, neatly into a very ignorant cishet understanding of what sexuality is. So yeah, there's a lot to it that I think that's another form of violence, and I guess erasure, because it's not understanding that queerness can be lived differently. People can be queer in different contexts, and they don't have to come out, and they don't have to prove their sexuality in order to be valid in their sexuality.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm glad you raised that point about coming out, because when we have new members join LGSM, we read out a statement, and in that we put in the caveat that some of us will probably maybe never want to come out, and that's okay. That doesn't mean your experience as a queer person is any less valid. And I think it sort of falls into a lot of those cis het expectations of what it is to be queer, that you have this coming out and then you fall into one of these boxes. But being queer, if that's how you label yourself, or LGBT, is a lot more nuanced. It's different for everyone. So I'm really, glad you raised that point. There's a couple of other questions, maybe we can answer those together. So there's one here. Would you agree that these issues of migration citizenship, who is and isn't a good citizen within a nation state, should basically be addressed from a decolonization framework rather than addressing each issue in isolation? I know you kind of touched on that idea of not looking at things in silos.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, again, sort of, I touched on it a little bit in the chat, but maybe I'll expand a bit because I'm not sure if it was very clear. But yeah, essentially, sort of different communities are, you know, the idea that someone is a good citizen or a bad citizen, or deserving or undeserving, goes beyond like your migration status. It goes beyond like your queerness. It encompasses all these things. It encompasses your race, your sexuality, your religion, all these things. Like, we haven't really spoken much about, I mean, we've touched on it indirectly about Islamophobia as well, but that's also part of it. So yeah, as in these bordering and sort of, I guess, the ideal citizen, in the way that Britain would envision the ideal or the model citizen, is someone who's white, someone who is, you know, economically productive, someone who isn't homeless, someone who isn't disabled, someone who is straight. So all these like different things like can't be seen in isolation, because people obviously exist who are who have more than one marginalized identity. And so, yeah, like the concept, the way the Western nation state functions is the way the modern nation state functions is a very like new Western concept. Like the creation of states kind of came about, like began to come about sort of with like decolonization movements and all this like during that time. And so we also have to think about like sort of certain communities like in pre-colonial times that sort of like lived without the demarcations or borders that we would attribute to states today, and they would have existed in different like communities, different tribes. And actually, when these communities were colonized, sort of barriers were drawn, like splitting up communities that were living together. So it's a very arbitrary and like messed up way. Like just bordering in and of itself has a very like long colonial history. So it's like impossible to look at it you know, without looking at colonization, especially because segregation, gentrification, these are all forms of bordering, and they have long colonial histories as well.
Yeah, definitely. I guess following on from that, Hannah has asked a question. Thinking about sharing stories and knowledge as a way to interrupt bordering tactics, how can we be in an ethical relationship with migrant communities and storytelling in a way that's not extractive? I think that's a dilemma we have daily at MRN, is how can we put those voices and those stories and experiences very much in the lead, or highlight them on our comms or social media in a way that's not extractive or exploitative. And I guess for me it would be, certainly when I think about this on a day-to-day basis, it's that giving that person the ownership over their story and how they want it to be used, and how they want, not only within their story, but how they want our policy work to be shaped. It's not about us dictating to them what that should be. Particularly for me as a non-migrant and non-migrantized person, I don't want to dictate what that should look like. For me, when I interact with people in our network, I try as much as I can to place that ownership on in them and support them if they need or want. Anna, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this.
I mean, pretty much to echo what you said, really, it's just about sort of giving the person who the story is from the power to dictate how that story is going to be presented to the world and in what way. Yeah, I don't really have much else to add. You kind of hit it on the nail on the head.
Yeah, I think it was also something that we see in the sector a lot is things like lived experience leads or lived experience roles. But I think I certainly think about it as lived experience should be woven within not only the work an organisation does, but also the structure, the leadership structure, the staff structure. And I think that's something that we really try and do every day at MRN. Like, I think we're really proud of the fact that we're such a diverse team, not only within our staff, but our board and also our wider network, is making sure that those voices and experiences are driving the work every day. And I think it would be good to kind of see that replicated throughout the sector, and also being very open to the fact that we are still learning. Like, I think our Words Matter campaign is a really good example of that, because we are doing explainers about words that maybe we once used, and actually, because we've embedded that lived experience in the way that we work and who we are, that we've moved on a lot from using certain words or ideas or phrases, but also holding up our hands and saying we might still get that wrong, and that's okay. We're held accountable to migrants and migrantized people. If there are any other questions, please do put them in the chat. We've still got a few minutes left. There was one more question that I had, Anna, and again, I think that this is something that we think about a lot, is that in relation to queerness, especially like the role that the British Empire and colonialisms played in exporting homophobia, and now we're in a position where we're using the experience of LGBT people to kind of keep certain people out. But how do we, as an organisation that places that is really committed to decolonising the narrative and policy, how do we, I guess, try and raise awareness of the role that Britain's had in exporting homophobia? How can we do that? I know it's something that we do try and we thought about a lot, especially with LGBT History Month that's just gone. But I think we're still like at the tip of the iceberg with that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's like a lot to explore. It's a very like deep and like complex issue. There's a lot to it. But I would say, I mean, in terms of sort of looking at queerness through like a decolonial lens, or looking at queerness in a way that doesn't ignore like colonial histories, I guess I would say like a very important thing to realize is that the sort of, even in countries where like queerness is, you know, no longer criminalized, that doesn't necessarily, like, so even in countries where those anti-sodomy laws introduced by the British Empire have now been repealed, that doesn't mean that queer people, you know, it's all good for them, because, you know, like sort of colonial era narratives like do continue to persist even if laws do change. And I guess with colonized communities, like something that I've been reading about a lot is sort of the way that if you are from a community that you've been like colonized, you will kind of, it's very easy to sort of fall into the mindset of viewing LGBT rights as like a Western concept, or like even as a Western imposition. And if you are from a community that's been colonized, it's like, well, I don't want to be colonized anymore. I view this as a way of like a form of like further colonization, like further like imposing things on us that we don't want. But it's actually about understanding that, you know, queer histories are sort of like, there are vivid queer histories in like multiple like pre-colonial communities. So it's sort of about realizing that, but also recognizing that some of those histories might be hard to unearth because of the function that colonization has played in sabotaging them, and then hypocritically turning around like a few decades later and being like, oh, actually, you know, now it's politically convenient for us to back LGBT rights, but we're not going to acknowledge, you know, all this that we did to your queer communities abroad. So yeah, I think it's just about sort of acknowledging that it doesn't end with rights or like a legal framework. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also as well, it goes back to if we are like going to a space where we want to like platform stories. There was a member of our community who anonymously shared their experience of being a queer asylum seeker, sharing those stories in a way that ultimately keeps people safe. And yeah, going back to that concept of like, how do you make sure it's not exploitative and extractive? And as important as those stories are in like decolonizing and the narrative and raising awareness of how Britain has exported a lot of homophobia, but making sure that we do keep those people safe, particularly in a very hostile and homophobic asylum system. If there are no more questions, I hope I didn't miss any, but I think if there's nothing else, I think we can look at wrapping up. Anna, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to close on. I mean, you've covered so much in this conversation, and like definitely I have a lot to think about as well from this conversation, and we can think about how to take some of these thoughts forward in our work.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of sort of comments that I'm looking at, yeah, there's a comment that was just left that is like a really good comment. I don't actually know how to react to comments, otherwise I would have reacted to it. But it's sort of saying that in some societies, sexuality might be taboo, and like the Western context is very like individualistic, whereas other contexts are a lot more like communal focused. So it's, yeah, I think that's a very important point that needs to be like thought about, because everything is like nuanced.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm still like soaking in all this information that we've talked about, and we have a lot more things planned in the future to talk about this issue, particularly in June when Pride Month is coming up, and I'm sure that we will talk more about queerness and migration following on from this event. So if you don't follow us on social media or you're not subscribed to our newsletter, definitely do give those a follow. We talk a lot about not only queerness, but also how other identities intersect with migration. I would like to apologise again for the slight mishap that seems to have happened with some of the speakers. We have followed up with them, so hopefully they will share their reflections with us, and we can share those with event participants after this event, and also hopefully share some of the theories and bits of this discussion on our social media, on our website after this event. Thank you to Anna as well. You've shared a lot in this event, and hopefully what we can do after is sort of shape that into a piece of work. But thank you everyone as well for attending today. Please do drop either myself or Anna an email. Fiz, our CEO, has put our emails in the chat if anyone wants to get in touch, or contact us via social media as well. If there's anything that you would like to share with us, whether that's your story or just reflections that you've had during this conversation. And I hope that it has been insightful for, and stay tuned for more Who is Welcome events in the near future. Thank you, everyone.